In this video here, we're going to take a look at using decomposition to factor a trinomial. In this one, we're going to look specifically when a does not equal to 1. So it becomes a little bit more important that we know how to use decomposition, as logical reasoning is a little bit more difficult to solve. So let's start with our instructions, and we're going to look at the basics. If you've seen my other video on decomposition, you'll know that it has it's going to be very similar. It's going to have similar style, but we just have added in something other than 1 for our a value. So let's start again with looking at the form ax squared plus bx plus c. Now we have to know what a, b, and c represent. A represents that number in front of the x squared, b represents the number in front of x, and c represents the constant that comes in at the end. So I have them here. A in this case here is 2, b is 7, and c is -4. These three are values that can be used in order to solve using decomposition. All right, step 2. Step 2 is to step 1 here is to multiply a and c together. It's my second bullet, but first step really. Multiply a and c together. Now we have the a and the c listed up on top already, so we can multiply those together and we're going to get a value of -8. Now, it's different than when there was only a 1 for a, because now the number is going to be different, and we can't just use those two factors immediately to solve using logical reasoning. Step 2 is to find all pairs of factors for AC. So we're going to take -8 and we're going to find all of our factors. The first one, now you'll notice here, because it's a -8, one of them has to be negative. So I'm going to start with the small ones as negative. So -1 and 8, -2 and 4, -4 and 2, and -8 and 1. Here, if we swap the positive and negatives, it in fact is a different combination, even though it still gives us -8. Step 3 is to find the pair of factors which adds to b. Well, if we go back and look at b, b is 7. And so we have to try to find which pair adds to 7. Now be careful for the negatives in there, because again, a negative and a positive is going to make a number that is not just adding them together, right? It's a negative and a positive. So if we look at like -1 and 8, -1 and +8 would actually become +7. Perfect. Actually, there we go. We have our answer. It's -1 and +8. So we now know our combination that's going to add to b. And this is the combination that we're going to use to decompose our trinomial, specifically the middle term in our trinomial. So remember those two numbers, because I'll bring them back on the next slide. Our next step, number 4, is we need to rewrite our trinomial by splitting up the middle term. That's that decomposing piece that we saw. And so I have split up the 7x into -1x or -x and +8x. Now the order that you put it into doesn't matter. Personally, I like to do a negative then positive. It makes it a little bit easier to factor out later. If you want to do the positive and negative, that's fine as well. It just means that we have to potentially factor out a negative number, which we don't necessarily always have to do. So step 5, factor a greatest common factor for the first two terms and the last two terms. Let's take a look at the first two terms, 2x squared minus x. We want to try to factor out a greatest common factor from those two terms. Now, it's going to be an x. Okay? We're going to take an x out, and when we take an x out of 2x squared, it becomes just 2x. And when we take an x out of -x, it becomes -1. Now, if you've followed along in previous lessons that I've done, you'll know that the second one should be exactly the same. And in this case, we're going to divide both of them by 4. Our greatest common factor is 4. And we're going to get 2x minus 1 again. Okay, so when we divide 8x by 4, we get 2x. And when we divide -4 by 4, we get -1. All right, so that's important that we take out the greatest common factor. And by doing the greatest common factor, we should always get our brackets to look exactly the same. That's one of our factors, okay, right there. So here's going to be our final answer. We know that we have 2x squared plus 7x minus 4. We want to try to figure out what two sets of brackets give us this. And so the two greatest common factors that we pulled out the x and the 4 are going to become one of our binomials. So let's slide them right in there. So one of our binomials is going to be x plus 4. The second binomial, and this is our last step here, is going to be that the dividend that we got both times, so that's what's inside the brackets. Again, they're exactly the same, so it is going to be our second term. Now again, they should always be the same, but we're only going to use one of them as our second one.